When I was younger, I took a great fascination to mindfulness. There was something mystical about exuding this calm demeanor through everything. And somehow whenever I saw someone that exhibited kind of this idyllic state, I would one be immediately at ease, but two, I would wonder to myself, is such a state possible for all of us? And, the second question really got my mind thinking. And at first, you learn through imitation, right? You learn, if someone is at peace and you discover what they do during the day, you try to copy that. If they meditate, you spend a lot of time meditating. If they're reading a certain book or inspired by someone, you try to follow that. But ultimately, I discovered that, we all have our own paths. What works for one may not necessarily work for another. But that doesn't mean that we cannot achieve the ultimate state, even if we take different paths. The expression that I love is that, God has the same address, but there are different directions to get to him, right? When you type in, unless it's a sort of an out and back type of road that only one way you can go, whenever you type an address to someplace, whether that's your friend's house, whether that's the store, whether that's to, a different place, chances are, I've rarely encountered it, but chances are you'll find two or three different routes to get there. And life is the same way, except there's not only just two or three different routes to get to God, there's as many routes, if not more, as there are people in this world. So if there are 8 plus billion people in this world, there's 8 plus billion ways to connect with God. And each of them are special and accepted in their own way. I'll repeat, each of them are special and accepted in their own way. We sometimes believe that just because there are only 4 or 5 major faiths in the world, that these are the only ways to access God. But I believe all of us have our own ways of communicating and connecting with God. That even if we may fall within the boundaries of a certain faith or a certain way of life, that doesn't necessarily limit us from experiencing God in our own way. In fact, it shouldn't, right? You shouldn't bucket yourself into kind of this preset set of ideals or beliefs that tries to normalize everyone. You should embrace your individuality. And so, to kind of, the reason I bring all this up is because when I was watching others and I was inspired by this notion of mindfulness, I realized that there are different ways to get to mindfulness. The mindfulness that I was reading about when I was younger and that I was studying, a lot of people kind of followed a similar path, right? Meditation seemed to be at the crux of a lot of it. And I tried that, but I, like many others, perhaps most famously Eckhart Tolle, who has notably said that he doesn't do meditation in the traditional form, and just because one does not follow meditation doesn't mean that they cannot achieve mindfulness or a state of calm where one truly experiences something without the interference of thoughts, without the interference of being sucked into our thoughts. It's probably the more accurate way of describing it, because we all experience thoughts, but it's a matter of whether or not you follow those thoughts, whether you get sucked into its vacuum. And I found even the term to be kind of interesting as well, mindfulness, or the state of the mind being full. If you think about it, it should really be mindlessness, right? But we attribute that, we have a very negative connotation when someone is mindless, right? You make a mistake, someone makes a mistake and you say, why are you being so clumsy and mindless, right? pay attention. But in reality, that's not the recklessness part or not the clumsiness part, but the aspect of being mindless or of no mind. That is what we're truly talking about here. Not when the mind is full of racing thoughts and we get stressed and we get worked up and we're thinking all sorts of things and we're so identified with our thoughts. We're so identified with each of the different charges and narratives that those thoughts create. But really, when we are detached from those thoughts, we have a sense of independence from those thoughts, and we can ultimately see through those thoughts, right? That is when we can achieve true mindfulness. And whether that's, on a train, whether that's working on a work project, whether that's speaking with someone, even if we're not on the surface doing a meditation or a spiritual practice or whatever, we can still experience and enjoy the benefits of mindfulness. So I don't want you to kind of walk away thinking that there's only certain ways for you to achieve mindfulness. And if you have a different idea or belief system that you can't incorporate into this into your life. The fact of the matter is that you can, but you have to embody the spirit, not necessarily the form. Right? I've met folks that identify with a certain religion, and whenever I get into all these discussions of mindfulness and spirituality, they kind of scoff at that and they're like, well, what is spirituality? What do you mean spirituality? What is spirit, right? And these are good questions, right? But really what the heart of the matter is that sometimes, people have not spent the time to kind of look outside their faith or outside their way of looking at the world to embrace or, entertain other ways of looking at life, right? And so usually I've seen those folks with due time, with due awareness, they will, embody and incorporate some of those elements, even though they might not be quote unquote spiritual, and they might identify as a Muslim or a Christian or as a Hindu. There will be aspects of that sort of naturally blend into their daily practice. They might have some mindfulness techniques. They might have some time to meditate. If not, sitting cross-legged on the ground, then at least, closing one's eyes and breathing slowly and uttering a few words or mantras, right? So don't get lost and bogged down by all the different labels of it. Um, these are all just, kind of the street and the freeway labels, right? What matters is ultimately the address. And however you get to God, however you get to spiritual awakening is secondary. It's not as important. What matters is if you appreciate the spirit of mindfulness, which is to give your full attention to something, to not be swept away by your thoughts, to kind of go with the flow, really, right? Because that's ultimately what it is life is a series of events. And if you are of the school of thought that everything is predestined, then it becomes a lot easier for you to accept that everything is already set. Even if you strive towards something, even if you work towards something, there are elements that are beyond your control. And so it's very hard for us to say that we have full freedom and free will. Even the one that completely believes in free will must, to some degree, accept the fact that there's more that we can't control than there is that we can control. So by that logic, how can it be that there is no destiny, that there is no element of predestination? And of course, that's not to cause sadness or grief, right? It's really just accepting it for what it truly is and going with the flow, embracing it, not trying to resist it, not trying to write a different story, not trying to do what we think is best. Because candidly, what we think is best may not be what's ultimately best for us. In fact, look at your own life and see how many times you didn't want something, but that actually ended up being better for you. Or things that you did want, but you did not achieve, and ultimately realized, wow, I dodged the bullet. Wow, that was a blessing in disguise. Wow, I actually, achieved or received something even better. So ultimately, you have to put your faith in God. You have to put your faith in the divine. And when you can do this, that's when mindfulness takes on a bigger meaning, right? To me, it's not just about relaxing. To me, it's not about entering a state of calm, training the mind. Those are all important. But to me, I like to take it one step further and to use mindfulness or to describe mindfulness in the terms of connecting with God. In fact, if I could change the word, it'd probably be God-fullness, right? Because when we talk about mindfulness, there's a lot of emphasis on the mind, right? But when we talk about God-fullness, we bring God in every facet of our lives. If we're eating an apple slowly and we're enjoying it, we're appreciating it, then we not only enter a state of calm, but we also develop a sense of gratitude that we are being nourished and sustained. We are also appreciating the circle of life, that this apple came from a seed, came from another apple, came from a tree, and we see kind of the interrelation of everything that led to this apple being in our hand. We see and appreciate the impermanence of everything, right? That apple can't just live forever. Every day it's rotting slowly, and after a while we can't eat it anymore. So you see, just the simple experience of eating an apple carries so much spiritual knowledge and wisdom behind it that one does not need to spend time reading 10 spiritual books or signing up for 20 different spiritual meditation classes. One can experience that, gain a glimpse into that just by slowing down, just by raising their awareness, just by pondering it a little bit more. Not to be inundated with thoughts, but in a way to let those thoughts subside and let God be the one to reveal the truth, to reveal the insights, to reveal a new form of understanding. This is the part that really excites me a lot because as much as I love to learn, as much as I am curious, as much as I love to feel like I'm in charge and I'm in the driver's seat, at the end of the day, it just amazes me how little I know. And I smile because that's when I acknowledge it, that's when I'm the most happy. It sounds so counterintuitive. You might think, well, how can you be happy if you don't know anything? Well, I'm happy because I recognize and I realize and I appreciate God's presence in my life. And the fact that even if I know nothing, which I believe is the fact, at least I have this connection with the divine that the answers and the truth will be revealed to me. And they will be revealed in their own time. They will be revealed in their own way. It may not happen in the way that I imagine, but they happen so much better. And they enable me to kind of connect the dots of my existence because everything is all related. Nothing is chance, nothing is coincidence. Everything is all related. And the more you can surrender and submit to the flow, the more everything becomes a lot easier. So mindfulness should really be Godfulness, should really be being full of God, being full of that energy, being full of that awareness. And perhaps you might get the opposite effect of being calm and at being at peace. You might actually feel emboldened. You might actually feel free. You might actually experience what I'm experiencing now, which is a sense of aliveness and alertness accompanied by goosebumps. This kind of this exciting feeling, right? We're always taught that when you're calm, when you're at ease, and I used to believe this a lot too, that is the state of true spiritual awakening. But as I've learned through, my studies of Sufi culture and poetry and literature, it's that there's also an element of fire, right? And being awake and being alive and feeling completely energized, reaching a state of ecstasy. Certainly, ecstasy and bliss can sometimes be two different things, right? If you're imagining a Buddhist monk meditating and you're imagining a Sufi dervish rolling, those could be two different ways of connecting with God, of connecting with one's true self, but both are equally beautiful and valid in their own right. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. And the same is true for how we approach and incorporate mindfulness into our life. I know I may get criticized for that. There may be a certain path or a structure to how people normally view mindfulness, but I believe it encompasses so much more than just being at ease, putting the mind at rest. To me, there's a sense of joy, a sense of passion, a sense of fire, a sense of aliveness that can only be experienced. It cannot be put into words. It cannot be conveyed in any other way but to fully experience it for ourselves. So, on that note, I hope that I've given you enough to see mindfulness in a new way. Maybe not a different way. Maybe it's an expansion or addition to how you're practicing mindfulness today, or how you wish to practice mindfulness today. But however you do it, know that in the spirit of today's video, that it's all valid. As long as you come with the right intention and the right purpose, it's all valid. Whether you take this freeway or that freeway, you're still going to arrive at the same destination. And that's all that truly matters. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it maybe shed some light on a very popular topic and theme. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. That definitely helps with the algorithm and things like that. But otherwise, thank you for your time. Thank you for being a supporter of the channel. All of you that have been following and commenting for a long time. And if you're new to the channel, I definitely encourage you to consider being a subscriber. I try my best to put out these videos on a weekly basis. And I really do appreciate the support. And I do hope that, all of these things are helpful to some degree, to some extent. But with that, I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you again for your time. And I hope to see you next time.